Strange tales told by a Dubliner. Be Turlough con me. Story number 8. Last man on the scaffold. It was the year 1793, and in France there was revolution. The reign of terror was at its height. Daniel O'Connell and his brother Maurice were boarders at the Jesuit college in Douai. Yet things were getting dangerous. The revolutionary mood was turning more and more anti-religious, and when they went out in groups to take a walk in the town, they heard mutterings of petit prêtre and maudit jésuite. So Daniel and his brother decided to leave France and head for home. They were able to arrange a passage on a ship departing shortly for England. The people had boarded and the ship was ready to sail when two young men arrived at the quay and rushed aboard as last-minute passengers. During the night voyage, the O'Connell brothers made the acquaintance of the two young men. They were Irishmen like themselves, and they were also a pair of brothers. Their names were John and Henry Sheares. They were well-to-do young men from Cork, and like the O'Connells, they had been stirred by the revolutions in America and France, and hoped that Irish freedom could be regained. The Sheares brothers had spent over a year in Paris, imbibing republicanism. They had become friendly with two of the Girondin leaders, Brissot and Roland, and their circle. "We saw the king lose his head on the public square in Paris," Henry told the O'Connells. "Ah, that was a fine moment. The crowd cheered when Louis's head fell. No one had much sympathy with him, that was plain." "And look," said John, bringing out a blood-stained handkerchief from his coat pocket. "Do you know what that is? It was given to us by the Abbé Edgeworth, an Irish Catholic priest. He was acting as chaplain to the king and accompanied him onto the scaffold. He dipped this handkerchief in the king's blood when the body was removed from the guillotine. He did not want to keep it, but gave it as a souvenir to us, to take away to Ireland." Daniel O'Connell shuddered as he looked at the thing. How terrible the whole business is, this revolution. It means endless bloodshed. Even the king. "Aye," said Henry Sheares in answer, "they have pulled down the king from his throne and finally killed him. Now they are a republic, as they need to be. They need no king to rule over them. The people decide. That is how it is in America too now, and that is as it should be." "Surely there is a better way than this," groaned Daniel, looking at the bloody handkerchief. "This is the only way," said John Sheares. "Revolution. It has happened in America, and it has happened in France. And it can happen in Ireland," added Henry hotly. "God knows it would be good to throw off the English yoke," said Daniel. "It is difficult for us to bear it. Our family, I mean, for we are Catholics." "Then revolution is the only way," said John. "Liberty for all, under a republic. An English king will never grant equality to Irish Catholics. We know that." "So why have you left Paris yourselves? Is it too dangerous for foreigners? Might you be taken as spies?" "There is a risk," said John. "People look on us suspiciously, although we know Brissot and Roland and the rest, and were received in their houses. But the real reason is that we cannot remain away from Ireland now. Things are going to be happening." He looked at his elder brother. "Yes," said Henry, We are going home to foment revolution in Ireland. There is already an organisation called the United Irishmen. They are pledged to organise a military uprising against the English and to set up an Irish republic where all men will be equal. We are going to join them. We will tell them what we have learned in Paris. We will show them this handkerchief, he added, brandishing the Grisly souvenir, and they will see that a king can fall, and a whole tyrannical system of government with him. The two young O'Connells shrank back from the bloody thing instinctively. Daniel, in particular, was very uneasy on being shown this grisly souvenir by the brothers. It is said he never forgot it. "Tell us more of Louis's execution," said Daniel to the Sheares after a while. "How did he die?" "He died with a certain amount of dignity, as best he could. People could see he was trying to maintain the special status of a king, even on the scaffold. He was allowed to have his chaplain with him, the Abbé Edgeworth. The Abbé told us that when they mounted the scaffold and looked at the execution machine ready to do its work, King Louis said to him, 'Je boirai cette calice jusqu'à la lit.' I shall drink this chalice to the dregs." At this Daniel groaned. So he was like Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, foreseeing his crucifixion. "Aye," said Henry with a grim chuckle. He could not help himself from equating himself with the Saviour. So are all kings. They think they are halfway between God and man. Daniel said, "I only feel sorry for him." "Aye, one could feel sorry for him there," said John. "But think of all his misdeeds, everything he did to obstruct the revolution, and you will not feel so sorry for him." "But it is such a cruel thing to kill any man for his political beliefs, or his lack of the right beliefs." "We saw the introduction of the guillotine," Henry informed them. "Before, when the people killed aristocrats, they hung them on a lamppost, but when the guillotine was brought in, death was dealt in a quicker and more humane way." The guillotine was a recent invention. It had been proposed by a humane physician, Dr. Guillotin, to the National Convention. He thought a machine that would dispatch the prisoner quickly and unerringly would be far better than existing methods. It would be more in keeping with ideas of human dignity and individual basic rights. It would also mean that there was one impersonal method of dispatch for all condemned citizens, whereas before aristocrats were beheaded with an axe and commoners were hung. So there was a public competition for a functioning execution machine, and the winning design came from an Austrian musician and harpsichord maker in Paris, Tobias Schmidt. Now, the harpsichord was a step beyond traditional musical instruments like the flute, the violin, and so on. Music was not coaxed out of it directly, be blown into a hole, or playing the strings, but rather be depressing keys on a keyboard, which then caused the strings inside the box to be plucked mechanically. It was a music-making machine, one might say. So who better than a harpsichord maker to build an execution machine that went beyond the crude direct application of the noose or the axe? The guillotine proved to be a godsend to the revolution, which had so many enemies of the people to dispatch. In fact, it could be seen as part of the Industrial Revolution, which was beginning then. It streamlined execution on an industrial scale. A long line of prisoners could be quickly dispatched, and it was still out on the public squares in the good old days, and the crowd could roar its approval as heads fell in the basket, one after another. On arriving in England, the Sheares and O'Connells returned to their homes in Ireland, and little was heard of Daniel O'Connell for a while. In the meantime, the revolution in Paris went on devouring its own. In October, the Queen, Marie Antoinette, followed her husband to the scaffold. Also guillotined around this time were the politicians of the Girondin party that had fallen out of favour, Brissot and Madame Roland. Roland himself escaped, and it was thought that his wife could remain safely in Paris. But the revolutionaries arrested her anyway, and since she had been a revolutionary activist in her own right, they sent her to the guillotine. Executed along with her that day was an unfortunate man named Lamarche, who was overcome with terror. Having arrived at the foot of the scaffold, she invited him to go up first. "Montez le premier, monsieur," she told him. "The sight of my blood would make you die twice. You should not experience the horror of seeing my head roll." At this point, the executioner intervened and said that this was not the custom. But she silenced him by saying dryly, "I can wait." When she did appear on the scaffold, surrounded by a great crowd, she looked at a statue of Liberty that was erected on the square and exclaimed, "Ô liberté, que de crimes on commet dans ton nom." Liberty, what crimes are committed in your name? When Monsieur Roland, who was in hiding, heard the news that his wife had been guillotined in his place, he fell into despair. He went out alone into the woods and stabbed himself to death with a knife, clutching a note in which he implored any passer-by to bury his body so that it would not be devoured by wild animals. But alas, it was a hard winter, and no one passed that way. When his body was found in the spring, it had been half eaten away by hungry wolves. Meanwhile, in Dublin, the Sheares brothers involved themselves in the United Irishmen and had a key role in plotting the 1798 rebellion. They themselves never actually took part in the fighting because their organisation was riddled with government spies and they were arrested before the rebellion could begin. The Sheares brothers were tried before Lord Carleton, the Chief Justice of Ireland at the time. His involvement in the case was criticised by many because their late father had once appointed him their guardian. Yet they were convicted of high treason and condemned to be hung, drawn and quartered. As the rebellion was already in full swing, the sentence was carried out hastily. Being hung, drawn and quartered was a nasty business, a lot less humane than the guillotine. First of all, the prisoner was half hanged, then cut down alive, and laid on a table to be dismembered by the hangman. In earlier times, the hangman had first cut off his privy parts, but later this was omitted, and either his heart was cut out of his breast, or his belly cut open, and his entrails torn out. The sentence said that the Sheares brothers' entrails were to be cut out of them and burned before their eyes. Then they were to be beheaded. The two brothers were executed together, and understandably, Henry was filled with horror at what was to come. But his brother John held him by the hand, and thus they were executed, hand in hand. Now, not long after came Robert Emmet's rebellion in 1803. He was hunted down and captured and brought back to Dublin, where he was tried before the notorious hanging judge, Lord Norbury. Emmet was duly convicted of high treason too, and condemned to be hung till he was dead, and then beheaded. The law had changed somewhat in the meantime, as we notice. This was a concession to the softening of manners and the humane execution provided by the guillotine. This meant that the prisoner was left to hang until he was really dead, and only then taken down and his head cut off. At this point, the hangman took up Emmet's head and marched around the edge of the scaffold with it, crying, "People of Ireland, behold the head of a traitor." O'Connell, who had qualified as a lawyer, took no part in either rebellion, but the Sheares brothers, whom he'd met on the voyage between France and England, or of Emmet, whom he had also known personally. If he was a Republican and supported the rebellions in secret, as some suggested, he didn't come out openly in favour of them. He was, however, not averse to physical fights and duelling. In 1815, he was challenged to a duel by a man named John de Stair, a Dublin political figure descended from a Huguenot family. They met out in County Kildare at a remote churchyard. The terms of the duel were a case of pistols each, 10 paces apart, each to fire according to his judgment at the drop of a handkerchief. De Stair, who was reputed to be a crack shot, fired first, but he missed badly and his ball only landed near O'Connell's feet. O'Connell fired low, trying not to kill his opponent. But he struck him in the groin and the ball lodged in his spine, so he died a few days later. After this, O'Connell felt very remorseful and guilty and compensated the man's family. He resolved never to get involved in duels again. It was after this time that he finally turned against violence in all its forms, personal or political. Instead, O'Connell began to follow a different way, seeking first Catholic emancipation and then the repeal of the union with Britain by peaceful agitation. He was successful in the first of these projects in 1829. As for the second, he orchestrated a campaign of monster meetings, as they were called. But when he proposed to hold one at Clontarf outside Dublin and predicted that 1 million people would attend, the British government forbade it and sent a gunboat into Dublin Bay. This was in 1843. Before the scheduled speech at the monster meeting to be held in Clontarf, O'Connell had this dream. He had come to give a speech to a huge crowd. There was a wooden scaffold built for him to speak from. Accompanied by well-wishers, he strode to the foot of the stairs and put his foot on the first step. But a priest in a black gown stood at the top of the steps, looking mournfully down at him. He said nothing, but held up a blood-stained white handkerchief. O'Connell was seized with a nameless dread and retreated back into the crowd. At the last moment, then, O'Connell called off the meeting in Clontarf, fearing bloodshed. After that, his political influence declined. He had told many an Irish audience, "You must be prepared to live as slaves or to die as free men." But in the end, he shrank from taking the risk. He didn't want to have the blood of free men on his hands. Both his English enemies and his Irish supporters saw that he could not take the decisive step to revolution. They esteemed him less as a result, for different reasons. In the meantime, Daniel O'Connell began to be plagued with nightmares, and it went on for the rest of his life. It was always the same thing. He was condemned to death, but somehow managed to escape the scaffold. In one nightmare, a Roman governor condemned him to be crucified, but then forgot to have the sentence carried out. In another nightmare, he had been sentenced to death by hanging, and was brought to the prison where the sentence was to be carried out. He was shown through the cell windows, the gallows being built for him across the street, for he was to be hung the next day. Yet he was not particularly perturbed, and thought it would never happen. He was left alone there for a while. He felt blasé about the whole thing as he walked around and looked out through the bars into the prison courtyard below, which looked more like that of a hospital or a university than a prison. What he could not figure out was that there seemed to be no rope on the crossbeam of the gallows, so that a hanging could hardly be carried out. How would they do it? Then he started to think about the facts of hanging, of being hauled aloft and choked and your neck broken. How long might it take? He realized fully that this was going to happen to him. The thought was so intolerable that he awoke. In another dream, he was seated at a table with a court official, who was not even a judge, who informed him he had been condemned to death, and he read him the sentence aloud. While the man was reading, O'Connell glanced down at the document and noticed distractedly that there was a mistake in one word of it which should be corrected. He could see this reading it upside down. But then he realized with a start that this idle thinking of his would have a sudden end. There would be no more thinking, because the person who was doing the thinking would be no more. The thought so filled him with dread that he awoke, panting. In yet another dream, he had been condemned to death for some unstated reason. This time he was to be guillotined. He was sitting in some public room, and a grey-haired man in a frock coat was explaining to him how the execution was to take place. He showed him a contraption of rods and chains, which, he said, was used to secure the arms and legs of the prisoner in position, so that he could not move when his head was placed in the lunette, awaiting the fall of the blade. This man also told him that he should be sure to hold his tongue back in his mouth, because otherwise, when the blade fell, the tongue might be severed by it. Why this should be a matter of concern was not clear to him. However, the man went on explaining this in a matter-of-fact way, while his horror at there being no escape increased. Finally he woke up. Another time he was standing at the foot of a scaffold in his dream, seemingly as one of the crowd that had assembled to witness an execution. He was conversing with two gentlemen he knew, and then one of them said, "Better not keep Jack Ketch waiting." He followed the direction of their gaze, and there above him on the scaffold was the hangman, holding a noose in one hand and beckoning to him with the other. In front of him were steps, the 13 steps to the gallows. So he was the one who was going to be executed. He was not an idle spectator after all. Finally, he dreamed he was out one night, and he came to a scaffold on a public square where a great crowd had formed. There was a long line of people waiting to go up the steps. As he watched them move forward, he started to recognize some of them. There were the Sheares brothers. There was Roddy Macaulay, and William Orr, and Kelly the boy from Killaan. There was Robert Emmet. There was one whom he knew must be Brissot, for he was singing the Marseillaise as he mounted the steps. The last was a woman, whom he knew could be none other than Madame Roland. She turned to look at him, and, gesturing to the 13 steps leading up to the scaffold, she paused and said, "Montez en premier, monsieur." He shuddered and drew back. She mounted the steps herself then, with an air of decision. But she was not the last. There were others following, who he guessed must be Saint-Just, Robespierre, and Danton, all of them condemned in their turn, and a sorrowful man who was accompanied by a confessor, holding a white handkerchief in his hand, and who he knew must be Louis XVI. Then there were others, a sorrowing grey-haired woman among them, who must be Marie Antoinette. And then there was a man holding a sheaf of legal papers, who must be the public prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, now hoisted with his own petard. He was one of a group of 16, the last to be sent to the guillotine by the revolutionary tribunal. They all shuffled forward to the 13 steps and mounted them one after another. Fouquier-Tinville was the last of all. As each of these appeared on the scaffold, the men's crowd roared with delight. O'Connell trembled with fear, not just at the guillotine or the hangman's rope and axe, but at that roar from the crowd. Often he had stood on a wooden stage and heard a huge crowd roar with pride or anger or sorrow as he spoke to them. But now this was different. This was the end. This was the scaffold, with 13 steps leading up to it, and on it were the gallows and the guillotine. Seeing no way out now, he climbed the 13 steps without being prompted by anyone. He was the last man on the scaffold. Why should he escape when so many were losing their heads, he thought resignedly. When he reached the floor of the scaffold, there was such a crowd of victims waiting to be dispatched that he couldn't see beyond them. But finally an executioner came round the edge of this crowd and looked at O'Connell. "There are too many at once," he said. "Go down. Go back down again." A chaplain stood behind him, looking sorrowful, holding a white handkerchief stained with blood. O'Connell turned and walked down the 13 steps again. He walked away slowly among the crowd. He was a free man. He felt numb with relief. When he awoke, however, he was glad that it had been a dream. In 1847, Daniel O'Connell died, not on the scaffold, but in a bed in an inn while travelling on a pilgrimage to Rome. He died a broken and disappointed man. His last will was that his body was to be dismembered. He said, "My body to Ireland, my heart to Rome, my soul to God." His dying wish was granted. Before his head and body were sent back to be buried in Dublin, his heart was cut out of him, embalmed and placed in a silver casket, and brought to the church of the Irish College in Rome, where it was interred in a vault. Now, later on, the Irish College was sold, and during the move to a new location in the city, the priests went to the vault to retrieve the casket so they could take it with them. It was gone. Daniel O'Connell's severed heart has never been found to this day. You have been listening to Last Man on the Scaffold by Turlough Conmee, from Strange Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.